April 1946. Iowa farmland stretched flat and endless under a pale morning sky. Along County Road 17, 12 German women prisoners stood holding shovels, repairing fence posts in the wet earth. They wore faded work clothes and kept their eyes down. These women had been told for years that America was dying, a nation of chaos, poverty, and violence barely holding itself together. Then an engine sound broke the silence. Over the hill came a cherry-red Ford coupe. Behind the wheel sat a teenage girl, alone. One hand on the steering wheel, the other adjusting the radio. She was singing. She waved as she passed, casual and fearless, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Annalise's shovel hit the ground. A child, driving her own car, to school. Not an officer's daughter. Just an ordinary American teenager. If they lied about this, she whispered to herself that night, what else did they lie about? Before we dive in, if you want more incredible untold stories that history forgot, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. April 1946. The morning air along County Road 17 smelled of wet earth and something green pushing up through last year's stubble. Annalise Hoffman drove her shovel into the soft ground and tried not to think about how much Iowa looked like the farmland outside Berlin before the bombs came. 12 women worked the fence line that morning, their faded blue work dresses marking them as prisoners, even though no one bothered with chains anymore. The war had been over for nearly a year, but they were still here, still enemy, still waiting to learn what came next. The guard, a young corporal with a farmer's hands and a bored expression, sat on the tailgate of the truck smoking and reading yesterday's newspaper. He barely watched them. Annalise found this more unnerving than if he'd stood over them with a rifle. In the camps back home, guards had been everywhere, always watching, always ready. Here the Americans acted like 12 German women with shovels posed no threat at all. Maybe they didn't. Maybe that was the strangest thing about captivity in Iowa. Nobody seemed particularly afraid. Ruth Fisher worked 3 posts down, moving with the economical grace of someone who'd learned to conserve energy during long shifts in field hospitals. She caught Annalise's eye and offered a small nod. They'd learned to communicate in glances. Words drew attention. Silence kept you invisible. Invisibility kept you safe, even here where safety seemed to be the default rather than something you fought for. The sound came from the east, a low rumble that didn't match the rhythm of farm equipment. Annalise straightened, one hand shading her eyes against the climbing sun. The other women heard it too. They stopped mid-swing, mid-breath, bodies going still the way animals freeze when something unexpected moves through their territory. Over the hill came a car. Not a military jeep or a transport truck, but a cherry-red Ford coupe that gleamed like something from a magazine advertisement. It moved fast, too fast for the rutted country road, and as it crested the rise, Annalise saw something that made her shovel slip from her fingers and thud into the dirt. A girl sat behind the wheel. Not a woman. A girl. Maybe 16, maybe 17, alone in that candy-bright car with one hand loose on the steering wheel and the other reaching for the radio dial. Her dark hair caught the wind through the open window. She was singing. Annalise couldn't hear the words over the engine, but she could see the girl's mouth moving, see the easy smile, see the complete lack of fear or hesitation as she piloted 2,000 pounds of metal and chrome down a public road without a single adult in sight. The girl noticed them as she passed. Her hand came up in a wave, casual and friendly, the kind of greeting you'd give to neighbors hanging laundry or kids playing in a yard. Then she was gone, the Ford's taillights disappearing over the next rise, leaving only dust and the fading growl of the engine and a silence so thick Annalise could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She stood there frozen, while her mind tried to reconcile what she'd just seen with everything she'd been taught. The newsreels had shown breadlines in American cities, desperate men fighting over scraps of work, racial violence tearing communities apart. The propaganda minister's voice still echoed in her memory, smooth and certain, explaining how America was a dying nation strangled by its own weakness and degeneracy. Germany would win because Germans were disciplined, unified, strong. Americans were soft, fractured, barely holding their society together. But a child had just driven past in her own private automobile. Not an officer's daughter, not someone's chauffeur. Just a teenage girl going somewhere on a Tuesday morning, singing along to the radio, waving at enemy prisoners like they were ordinary people working an ordinary job. Annalise bent to retrieve her shovel. Her hands were shaking. Beside her, another woman laughed nervously. A sharp sound quickly cut off. Someone muttered something in German about American excess, about a country that gave cars to children while the world starved. But the words felt hollow, defensive, like trying to patch a crumbling wall with paper. The corporal hadn't even looked up from his newspaper. They worked in silence for the rest of the morning, but the silence felt different now, charged with questions nobody wanted to ask out loud. When the truck came to collect them at noon, Annalisa climbed into the back and sat next to Ruth. The older woman's face was carefully neutral, but her fingers worked at the hem of her sleeve, folding and unfolding the fabric in a nervous rhythm Annalise had learned meant Ruth was thinking hard about something. That evening in the barracks, after the thin vegetable soup and dark bread that passed for dinner, the women gathered in small clusters on their bunks. Someone brought up the red car. Another woman laughed and said Americans were frivolous, wasteful, typical of a nation that didn't understand real sacrifice. But the laughter died quickly. Nobody else joined in. Ruth sat on the edge of her bunk, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough to cut through the nervous chatter. What else did they lie about? The question hung in the air. Nobody answered. Nobody had to. They all felt it. That crack spreading through the foundation of everything they'd believed, everything they'd been told, everything they'd used to make sense of the war and their place in it. 2 days later, Captain Brennan announced a new work program. Local high school needed help with kitchen duty, laundry, building maintenance, supervised, paid in camp script, completely optional. 6 women could go. Annalise volunteered before she'd finished thinking it through. Ruth caught her arm afterward, eyes serious. "Be careful what you go looking for," Ruth said quietly. Some truths cost more than ignorance. But Annalise couldn't stop thinking about that girl in the red Ford, couldn't stop wondering what else existed beyond the fence line that nobody had bothered to tell them about. That night she lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the soft breathing of 11 other women who'd also believed the promises, also worn the uniform, also discovered too late that belief wasn't the same as truth. "What if we were wrong about everything?" she whispered in German to the darkness. The darkness didn't answer, but the question remained, growing larger with each passing hour, impossible to ignore. 3 weeks into the high school work program, Annalise had developed a routine that felt almost normal. She arrived at 7:30 each morning with Ruth and 4 other women, entered through the back door near the boiler room, and spent the next 6 hours washing dishes, wiping down tables, and mopping floors that smelled of industrial cleaner and tracked-in mud. The work was simple, mindless, the kind of labor that let her mind wander while her hands stayed busy. It was better than fence repair, better than sitting in the barracks counting the days until someone decided what to do with them. The townspeople were polite but distant. They said good morning when the women arrived, nodded thanks when a task was completed, sometimes offered coffee that was always accepted with quiet gratitude, but nobody lingered to chat. Nobody asked questions. The arrangement was cordial in the way of 2 dogs circling each other in a yard, acknowledging presence without inviting closeness. Annalise understood this. She didn't expect friendship. She was still the enemy, just one doing laundry now instead of routing military communications. The cafeteria during lunch service was controlled chaos. Hundreds of teenagers flooding in all at once, voices bouncing off tile and concrete, the clatter of trays and silverware creating a wall of sound that made Annalise's head ache. She stayed in the kitchen mostly, scraping plates and loading the industrial dishwasher, watching through the service window as American children moved through their ordinary day with an ease that still struck her as impossible. They were so loud, so careless with food. She watched them throw away half-eaten sandwiches, dump full cartons of milk down the drain, leave apples with one bite taken. The waste made her stomach clench. She started saving bread crusts in her apron pockets, old habit from Berlin when a crust of bread could mean the difference between making it through the afternoon or not. Ruth noticed one day, reached over without a word, and gently emptied Annalise's pocket back onto the counter. They got 3 meals a day at the camp, adequate portions, clean water. There was no need to hoard, but the body remembered scarcity even when the mind knew better. On a Tuesday in early May, Annalise was wiping down tables in the emptied cafeteria when she heard footsteps approaching from behind. She turned and found herself face to face with the girl from the red Ford. Up close, she was prettier than Annalise had realized, with intelligent dark eyes and a directness in her gaze that was distinctly American. She wore a sweater set and a plaid skirt, saddle shoes polished to a shine. She looked clean and healthy and utterly unconcerned about standing 3 feet from an enemy prisoner. The girl introduced herself as Maggie Chen. She said she was studying German, asked if Annalise would mind helping her practice conversation. The request was so unexpected that Annalise just stared for a moment, cloth still in hand, trying to process why an American teenager would want to learn the language of the country that had just lost the war. "Why would anyone bother learning German now?" she finally asked in careful English. Maggie's answer was simple and devastating in its sincerity. "My parents say the war was between governments, not people, and languages don't die just because countries do." Annalisa had no response to that. She nodded slowly and said she would help if the guards allowed it. Maggie smiled, thanked her, and walked away, leaving Annalisa standing in the middle of the cafeteria with a damp rag and a feeling like the ground had shifted slightly beneath her feet. The smell of the school lunches haunted her. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes, canned peaches and heavy syrup, fresh milk in small glass bottles, gravy and butter and chocolate cake for dessert on Fridays. The abundance was obscene. She'd watched Ruth's hands shake the first week as they scraped plates into the garbage, all that food wasted while Europe starved. But they said nothing. They were grateful for the work, grateful for the script they could use at the camp commissary, grateful that nobody spat at them or called them names. Gratitude was easier than anger. That weekend, Captain Brennan gathered all the women in the common room and set up the projector. He'd gotten hold of newsreel footage, he explained quietly. Footage from Germany, from Berlin. He thought they should see it. They had a right to know what had happened while they were gone. The images flickered on the wall in grainy black and white. Ruins, endless ruins. Whole city blocks reduced to rubble and exposed beams and chimneys standing alone like grave markers. Hamburg, Dresden, Munich, Cologne. Cities Annalise had known, had visited, had thought of as permanent and solid and real. Now they were landscapes of destruction, women picking through debris, children with hollow eyes, old men pushing carts loaded with salvaged bricks. Ruth's hands shook in her lap. She folded them together tightly, knuckles white, but the shaking didn't stop. Another woman wept silently. Most just watched in numb silence, trying to comprehend the scale of what they were seeing, trying to locate in that devastation any trace of the country they'd left behind. When the reel ended and Brennan turned on the lights, he didn't offer commentary or justification. He just said he was sorry, that they deserved to know, that he couldn't imagine what it felt like to see their home cities destroyed. Then he left them alone to process it. Annalisa sat very still, her mind replaying the images, overlaying them with memories of Berlin before the war. She thought about her mother who'd died in the bombing. She thought about her brother who'd written once to say he was heading east and not to look for him. She thought about the propaganda minister's voice promising victory, promising strength, promising that Germany would prevail because Germans were superior and disciplined and chosen. They'd been lied to. Completely. Thoroughly. The realization wasn't new, but seeing the evidence made it real in a way that words couldn't. Their leaders had promised victory while the cities burned, had promised strength while children starved, had promised a 1,000-year empire that lasted 12 years and left nothing but rubble. And here in Iowa, Captain Brennan treated them with more honesty than their own government ever had. He showed them the truth even when it hurt. He gave them dignity even in captivity. He followed rules that protected them instead of crushing them. The friendships that formed after that were tentative but real. Maggie started meeting Annalise twice a week to practice German conversation. She brought her textbook and a notebook and asked questions about grammar and pronunciation, and sometimes they just talked about ordinary things, carefully avoiding politics and war. Ruth began teaching basic first aid to the school's first aid club, showing teenagers how to bandage wounds and recognize shock, her steady nurse's voice turning medical procedures into something almost soothing. Small kindnesses accumulated like snow, each one barely noticeable alone, but together forming something substantial enough to stand on. One afternoon, Maggie brought her driver's manual to their session, held it up with a grin, and said Annalise should learn too. It was clearly a joke, but also a bridge. The idea that Annalise might someday, somewhere, be free enough to drive her own car to her own destination. The idea that she might have a future beyond fence repair and repatriation. For the first time since surrender, Annalise allowed herself to imagine it. Not Germany, maybe not even America, but somewhere, somehow, a life that belonged to her. May arrived with a warmth that felt like permission to hope. The Iowa countryside exploded into green, wildflowers dotting the roadside ditches, trees heavy with new leaves that rustled in the constant prairie wind. Spring felt different here than in Berlin, louder somehow, more insistent, as if the land itself was determined to prove that growth was still possible after destruction. The work program expanded. Captain Brennan announced that the local Methodist Church was hosting a community picnic and had invited the POWs to attend. Supervised, of course, but genuine hospitality nonetheless. Several women declined immediately, uncomfortable with the idea of socializing with townspeople who'd lost sons and brothers to German bullets. But Annalise volunteered. So did Ruth. They were past the point of hiding. They made potato salad from Red Cross packages the night before, Ruth directing the preparation with the precision of someone who'd cooked for field hospitals. Annalise peeled potatoes until her fingers cramped, then helped to mix in the vinegar and oil and carefully rationed spices. It felt strange to prepare food as a gift rather than rations. Strange but not unwelcome. The picnic was held in a park near the town center, long tables set up under oak trees, children running in chaotic circles while adults stood in clusters talking about weather and crops and the price of feed. The POWs arrived together, staying close to each other and to the corporal who'd driven them in. For the first few minutes, nobody approached them. Then an older woman with kind eyes brought over a pitcher of lemonade and paper cups, poured for each of them without asking, and said simply that she was glad they could come. The potato salad was placed on a table with dozens of other dishes, absorbed into the abundance of a community that clearly took its potluck seriously. Annalise watched people serve themselves, watched her own carefully prepared food disappear onto plates, alongside fried chicken and corn casserole and 3 different kinds of pie. Nobody commented on it. Nobody treated it as significant. It was just food at a picnic, ordinary and unremarkable. Someone produced an accordion. A man with gnarled farmer's hands and a gentle smile began to play. Old folk songs that transcended language, melodies that could have come from Germany or Iowa or anywhere people gathered to mark the passing of seasons. A few people started dancing, simple steps in the grass, children weaving between adults' legs. Annalise stood at the edge watching, feeling simultaneously included and separate, trying to reconcile this scene with everything she'd been taught about American moral decay. Maggie found her after an hour, flushed from running around with her friends, and asked if Annalise wanted to learn to drive. Really drive, not just talk about it. She'd gotten permission from her father and from Captain Brennan. The church parking lot was empty. It would be safe. Annalise's first instinct was to refuse. It felt too intimate, too much like friendship, too dangerous to want something she couldn't keep. But Ruth caught her eye from across the lawn and nodded once, a small gesture of encouragement that somehow gave Annalise the courage to say yes. The Ford's steering wheel was bigger than she'd expected, the leather warm from the sun. Maggie explained the pedals, the gear shift, the importance of checking mirrors. Then she slid over to the passenger seat and told Annalisa to start the engine. The key turned. The engine rumbled to life. Annalisa's hands gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. 3 careful loops around the parking lot. That was all. But for 3 loops, Annalise was just a woman learning to drive, not a prisoner or an enemy or a former believer in a failed ideology. Just someone behind the wheel of a car, navigating turns, managing speed, feeling the strange joy of controlling something powerful and mechanical and entirely separate from war. When she finally braked to a stop back at the starting point, she was laughing. Actually laughing, a sound she barely recognized coming from her own throat. Ruth watched from a bench at the edge of the lot, a rare smile softening her face. She held a letter in her lap, folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn thin. The letter from her husband Carl, written 18 months ago from somewhere in Poland, talking about the weather and how he missed her cooking and how he couldn't wait to come home. She'd carried it through surrender and transport and captivity, reading it whenever grief threatened to drown her completely. A woman approached the bench and sat down without asking permission. She was in her 50s, Ruth guessed, with gray streaking her brown hair and lines of sorrow carved deep around her eyes. She introduced herself as Helen Kowalski. Her son had died at Normandy, she said, June of 44, 22 years old. He'd wanted to be a teacher. Ruth waited for the accusation, the anger, the blame she'd learned to expect from those who'd lost loved ones. But Helen just sat there, hands folded in her lap, watching the teenagers in the parking lot. After a long silence, she spoke again. "I'm glad someone made it home," she said quietly. "Even if it's not him." The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. Unexpected kindness delivered without preamble or explanation. She had no response adequate to the moment, so they just sat together in silence. 2 women who'd each lost everything to the same war, sharing a bench in a grief too large for language. Dignity met dignity in that silence. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was fixed. But something passed between them that felt like recognition. The afternoon stretched golden and perfect, the kind of day that exists outside of time, suspended between what was and what might be. Children played without fear. Adults laughed without restraint. The accordion music drifted through the oak leaves and across the parking lot where Annalisa sat in the driver's seat of the red Ford, hands still on the wheel, marveling at how normal everything felt. Lilac bushes lined the edge of the park, heavy with purple blooms that scented the air with sweetness almost too intense to bear. Someone passed around cold lemonade in mason jars, condensation running down the glass. Teenagers gathered near the church steps, talking and laughing in the casual way of people who'd never had to worry about bombs or starvation or whether tomorrow would arrive. Maggie climbed back into the passenger seat grinning and asked if Annalise would want to try again next week. Then she grew serious, her young face suddenly older. "I want to stay," Annalise said before she could stop herself. "I want to start again here." Maggie considered this carefully, the way she considered most things, with a directness that Annalisa had come to respect. "You'd have to apply," Maggie said slowly. "It's complicated. Immigration, sponsorship, all kinds of paperwork. But maybe it's possible." That night in the barracks, Annalise helped Ruth draft a letter to the Red Cross. They were trying to trace Carl to find out definitively whether he was dead or alive or lost somewhere in the chaos of Eastern Europe's collapsed infrastructure. Ruth's hand shook as she wrote, but her words were clear and specific, providing dates and unit numbers and last known locations with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered in bureaucratic systems. Hope felt dangerous. Hope felt foolish. But for the first time since surrender, Annalisa allowed herself to feel it anyway. A small, fragile thing growing in the space between what had been lost and what might still be possible. Tomorrow the work would continue. The dishes would need washing, the floors would need mopping, but tonight, with the smell of lilacs drifting through the barracks windows and Ruth's letter folded carefully in its envelope, tomorrow felt like something worth waiting for. 2 weeks after the picnic, Captain Brennan called an assembly in the common room. His face was carefully neutral, but Annalise had learned to read the small signs of tension in people's bodies, the way shoulders held themselves differently when delivering bad news. The women gathered quietly, arranging themselves on benches and chairs, waiting for whatever announcement would reshape their precarious stability. All German POWs would be repatriated by July. No exceptions. The policy had been finalized at the federal level in response to domestic pressure about housing and jobs for returning American servicemen. Transport ships were already being scheduled. They would return to occupied Germany to whatever remained of their former lives, whether they wanted to or not. The words landed like artillery. Annalise felt the impact in her chest, a physical blow that left her breathless. Around her, reactions varied. Some women wept with relief, grateful for the chance to go home and search for surviving family. Others sat in stunned silence. A few nodded as if they'd expected this all along, as if hope had been foolish from the start. Annalise couldn't breathe properly. The friendship with Maggie, the driving lessons, the careful German conversations, and the cautious planning for a future that might include staying, all of it suddenly felt like a cruel joke. She'd let herself believe in possibility. She'd let herself imagine a life beyond wire fences and repatriation orders. And now the door was slamming shut, polite but final. Bureaucracy trumping individual stories. Ruth sat very still beside her, hands folded in her lap, face empty of expression. She'd been waiting for word from the Red Cross about Carl. Now it wouldn't matter. She'd be back in Germany before any answer arrived, if an answer ever came at all. The telegram arrived 3 days later. Red Cross notification, official and impersonal. Carl Fisher, medical sergeant, last seen in Soviet custody near Stalingrad, February 1945. Death confirmed by recovered records. Cause listed as typhus. He'd been dead for over a year. He died thinking Ruth was safe at home in Hamburg. He died not knowing she'd been conscripted, transported, captured. He died with a version of reality that had never been true. Ruth read the telegram twice, folded it carefully, placed it in her pocket next to the old letter she'd been carrying. Then she stopped speaking, not dramatically, not with announcement or explanation. She simply withdrew into silence, performing her duties mechanically, but offering nothing beyond the minimum required for daily function. Annalise tried everything. She brought Ruth tea. She sat beside her during meals. She attempted conversation about ordinary things, about the weather or the work schedule or nothing at all. But Ruth had retreated to some interior place where comfort couldn't reach, where grief was too large and too final to share. After 2 days, Annalisa stopped trying and just stayed close, a quiet presence that asked nothing and offered only proximity. The camp divided itself along invisible lines. Some women began planning enthusiastically for return, talking about finding siblings and cousins, about rebuilding homes, about the relief of speaking German everywhere without translation. They saw repatriation as liberation, a chance to reclaim identity and belonging. Others grew increasingly quiet, recognizing that they had nothing to return to except ruins and memories and the hard work of surviving in a destroyed country under occupation. Annalise received a letter from her brother. Brief, blunt, delivered through Red Cross channels that took months to route correspondence. Mother died in the Berlin bombing March 1945. I'm heading east with Anna. Don't look for me. That was all. No return address, no invitation to reconnect, just information and a clear boundary. She was functionally orphaned, unmoored, belonging nowhere. The school felt different after the announcement. Annalisa moved through her duties with numb efficiency, washing dishes and mopping floors, and avoiding eye contact with anyone who might offer sympathy. The waste of American abundance now felt like mockery rather than marvel. Of course, they could throw away food. Of course, teenagers could drive their own cars. Of course, everything here was easy and safe and overflowing. They'd won. Winners got abundance. Losers got shipped back to rubble. Maggie found her in the cafeteria after lunch service on a Thursday, 3 weeks before scheduled repatriation. She'd been crying, her eyes red-rimmed, her usual confidence cracked. She said she'd heard about the order. She said it wasn't fair. She said she was sorry. Annalise felt something break open inside her, all the careful control she'd been maintaining since Brennan's announcement. "Why does it matter?" she asked, hearing her own voice turn sharp and bitter. "Why did you bother being kind? I'm just a souvenir of your victory, something to feel good about before sending back where I belong." Maggie flinched but held her ground. "No," she said quietly. "You're a person. That's why it matters." But Annalise couldn't hear it. The propaganda voice had returned, the one she'd thought she'd left behind, whispering familiar certainties. "You were always the enemy. You'll always be the enemy." This kindness was temporary, conditional, meaningless. They won the war and you lost everything, and that's how it works. Power decides who gets mercy and who gets shipped back to starvation. She turned away before Maggie could respond, returned to the kitchen, picked up a dish rag, and began wiping down already clean counters with mechanical precision. When Maggie tried to follow, Annalisa asked her to leave, politely, in careful English, but firmly enough that Maggie understood she wasn't wanted. That evening, Annalisa told Captain Brennan she wouldn't return to the school program. She said she was needed at the camp for packing preparations. It was a lie they both recognized, but he accepted it without argument, just nodded and made a note on his clipboard and said he understood. Ruth finally spoke again 3 days later. They were sitting on their bunks in the evening quiet, other women playing cards or writing letters or mending clothes. Ruth's voice emerged hoarse from disuse. "They won the war," she said to no one in particular. "We lost everything. That's how it works." Annalisa had no response. The words were true in the blunt, brutal way that facts are true regardless of how they make you feel. Germany had gambled everything on conquest and lost. Now they would return to the consequences of that loss, to occupation and hunger and the long, cold work of rebuilding from nothing. The kindness they'd experienced in Iowa had been real but temporary, a brief respite that changed nothing about the fundamental equation of victory and defeat. The packing began. They had little to pack. A spare dress from the Red Cross, letters that would never be answered, small tokens received during the work program carefully saved. Annalise folded everything methodically, trying not to think about Maggie's driver's manual or Ruth's first aid demonstrations or the way lilacs had smelled at the church picnic, trying not to think about the Red Ford or the promise of ordinary freedom or any of the futures she'd been foolish enough to imagine. The emotional low was complete. Hope had been a mistake. Believing in possibility had been naive. The only truth that mattered was the one she'd learned in the bunker routing dispatches while Berlin burned. Power decided everything, and they had none. 3 weeks before repatriation, Annalisa stopped eating much. Not dramatically, not enough to draw official attention, just pushing food around her plate and claiming she wasn't hungry, saving her portions for women who still had appetite. Ruth noticed but said nothing. They'd both retreated into survival mode, the kind that required minimum energy expenditure and maximum emotional distance. Speaking cost energy. Caring cost energy. Better to go numb and functional, to become the kind of hollow that could be packed into a transport ship and shipped across an ocean without breaking further. The packing was nearly complete. Each woman received a small cardboard box for personal belongings. Annalise's box held a spare dress, undergarments, a comb with missing teeth, letters from her dead mother saved from before the war, and the final note from her brother telling her not to look for him. Ruth's box held medical supplies she'd accumulated, Carl's last letter, the Red Cross telegram confirming his death, and a photograph of them on their wedding day looking impossibly young and hopeful. They arranged these items carefully, treating the ritual of packing with the same methodical attention they'd once given to military duties because routine was all they had left. On a Tuesday morning, when the June heat was already pressing down heavy and thick, a guard came to the barracks and said Annalisa had a visitor at the fence. She almost didn't. go. Visitors meant complications, meant feeling things she'd worked hard to stop feeling. But Ruth looked at her with those steady nurse's eyes and nodded toward the door, a silent instruction that Annalise's body obeyed before her mind could argue. Maggie stood on the other side of the fence, Captain Brennan beside her. She'd been crying, her face blotchy and swollen, and she held a large manila envelope against her chest like a shield. When she saw Annalise approach, fresh tears spilled over and she started speaking too fast, words tumbling over each other in her urgency to get them out before courage failed. She'd organized a petition, had gone door to door through town collecting signatures, had stood in the general store and the post office and outside church after Sunday service explaining the situation, asking people to sign a request that the government consider asylum for Ruth Fisher and Annalisa Hoffman. Not for all the POWs, she admitted, because that would have been impossible to argue, but for two women who had no family, no home to return to, who'd proven themselves trustworthy and kind and deserving of mercy. 140 signatures. Farmers and shopkeepers and teachers and students. Helen Kowalski had signed, the war widow who'd lost her son at Normandy. The school principal had signed. Maggie's parents had signed. People Annalisa had never met had signed. People who knew her only as a story Maggie told, a person rather than an enemy. Maggie handed the envelope through the fence. Her hands shook. She said she knew it wouldn't work, that the policy was federal and inflexible, that individual petitions rarely changed bureaucratic momentum, but she'd needed to try. She'd needed Annalise to know that she'd been seen, that her presence had mattered, that at least some people in this small Iowa town had learned something about choosing mercy over hate. The envelope was heavy. Annalise held it carefully, afraid it might dissolve if she gripped too hard, afraid this moment might turn out to be imagination or dream. Maggie kept talking, words spilling out between gasping breaths. She said she'd learned from Annalise that propaganda works both ways, that Americans had their own lies about Germans being monsters, that real people are always more complicated than government narratives allow. She said she was sorry. She said thank you. She said she'd never forget. Annalisa couldn't speak. Her throat had closed around words too large to fit through. She just nodded and held the envelope and tried to breathe while her entire carefully constructed numbness cracked open and grief poured through. She brought the petition back to the barracks and found Ruth sitting on her bunk, staring at nothing. She handed over the envelope without explanation and watched Ruth open it, watched her pull out the pages covered in signatures and handwritten notes, watched her read slowly through each name and comment. Some notes were simple, just a signature. Others included messages. We're grateful for your service teaching our children first aid. Thank you for showing us that enemies can become neighbors. You deserve a chance to start over. May God bless you both. Ruth read every word twice. Then she folded the papers carefully and placed them in her pocket next to Carl's letter and the telegram confirming his death. Her hands were shaking again, but differently this time, not with shock, but with something that looked almost like hope trying to resurrect itself from wreckage. He would have wanted me to remember this, Ruth said quietly, her first full sentence in days. That even in the worst, there's decency. That some people choose kindness even when they don't have to. Annalisa sat beside her and for the first time in weeks let herself cry properly. Not neat, contained tears, but ugly, gasping sobs that shook her entire body. Ruth pulled her close and held her the way she'd probably held wounded soldiers in field hospitals, steady and sure and refusing to let go. They grieved together for everything that had been lost and couldn't be recovered, but also for the unexpected grace of being seen as human by people who had every reason to refuse that recognition. The next morning, Annalise asked Captain Brennan if she could return to the school for one last shift. He approved immediately, clearly relieved that she was engaging again, that some spark of life had returned. The cafeteria smelled the same, industrial cleaner and teenage sweat and whatever mystery meat the kitchen was serving for lunch. Everything was ordinary and familiar and about to end. Maggie found her during the afternoon cleanup. She gave Annalise the driver's manual, the one she'd joked about weeks ago. It was signed now, covered in messages from Maggie's classmates. Someday, somewhere, you'll drive your own car. We believe in you. Thank you for teaching us it's possible to start over. One note in shaky handwriting from someone who'd clearly struggled with what to say simply read, "You made my sister less afraid of German accents. That matters." Annalise held the manual like it was sacred text. She tried to thank Maggie, but the words came out broken and inadequate. Maggie just hugged her, fierce and quick, then stepped back and said she had to get to class, but she'd be at the fence when the transport came to say goodbye properly. Repatriation Day arrived gray and humid, the kind of Iowa weather that promised storms by evening. The women lined up beside a military transport truck, their small boxes of belongings loaded in the back. Townspeople had gathered despite the early hour and the threatening sky. Not everyone, but more than Annalise expected. They stood along the fence line, quiet and respectful, bearing witness to departure. Helen Kowalski was there, standing very straight despite her age. The school principal. Several students from the first aid club that Ruth had taught. Maggie stood at the hall front, red-eyed but composed, holding herself together through visible effort. As the women climbed into the truck one by one, Captain Brennan shook each hand and wished them luck. When he reached Ruth, he held her hand a moment longer and said quietly that she'd been an honor to know. She nodded, unable to speak, and climbed aboard. Annalise was last. She paused at the truck's open back and looked at the assembled faces, at this small Iowa town that had shown her something she thought was impossible, that enemies could become simply people. That kindness didn't require agreement or approval, just the choice to see another person's humanity. Ruth's voice came from inside the truck, steady despite everything. "We'll survive this too." "We always do." The truck pulled away slowly, diesel engine grinding through gears. Annalise watched through the open back as the town receded, as Maggie raised one hand in farewell, as the high school building grew smaller and smaller. She thought about the red Ford, about driving in careful circles, about the taste of cold lemonade and the smell of lilacs, and the weight of 140 signatures saying that she'd mattered. She didn't know what waited in Germany. The ruins and the hunger and the long, impossible task of rebuilding. But she knew something she hadn't known before. Propaganda was fragile, built on lies that collapsed when tested against lived experience. Kindness was not fragile. It survived wars and borders and bureaucratic policies. It survived because people kept choosing it despite having every reason not to. In the distance, moving in the opposite direction on the same road where this had all begun, a cherry-red Ford coupe appeared. A teenage girl behind the wheel headed to school, ordinary and free. She didn't wave this time, didn't even notice the transport truck. Just drove past, radio playing, utterly unaware that she'd once cracked open a German woman's entire world view. Annalise closed her eyes and whispered in carefully practiced English, just for this moment, just for herself. "Thank you."